Hello again, everyone. It's me, Stuart. I'm back here with Ching Ho, and we're going to be continuing our conversations. This episode, it's wheelchair fencing and its benefits for able-bodied fencers. Your experiences. So introduce yourself, mate, and let's
Hi.
crack on.
Hi guys. I'm Ching Ho. With wheelchair fencing, I've actually, but I've actually had quite a bit of a little bit of experience with wheelchair fencing before coming to Durham. So it wasn't that alien to me. But when it came to wheelchair fencing in Durham, because I had a lot of it and I had people who wanted me to do wheelchair fencing with them,
Okay,
it gave me a
just one sec.
greater
So
insight into
just a point to
my life.
mention, the coach at Durham, Laszlo, used to be the Paralympic coach for Great Britain wheelchair fencing, right?
Yes.
For the London Olympics. That's why the wheelchair fencers are quite so good. Just to frame it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Just to frame it for everyone else. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
there you go.
Yeah. So back in Hong Kong, my coach actually also did coach the Hong Kong Paralympic team. So Allison, what he used to coach Allison quite a bit and coach Allison's teammates. Allison Yu, 2000 Paralympic champion 2012, Paralympic champion 2008. I don't know if she's what color her medal was in 2016. She's won so many medals. I have no idea when she's won what, when I usually do. But yeah, that kind of shows how good that kind of shows the level of Hong Kong's Paralympic fencing. So when I was a cadet, I used to fence. I used to train a lot with my coach, and once in a while, to improve the blade work of his students, he would get us to pay a visit to the Paralympic training facility in Hong Kong, and
Nice.
we would go to the place where the disabled fencers fenced, and we would just fence them over and over again. We'd fence everyone, and we'd fence everyone again, and then we'd do scenarios, but mostly it was just fights to bouts to 5, bouts to 15, and team fights. And that was where I got exposed to wheelchair fencing.
Your
And
first impressions?
I think I was gobsmacked, man, because uh, I didn't know there existed people in the world who beat the blade so hard, who bound the blade so tightly.
Yep.
Um, and I think I remember the end of my first 215s. I'd only fenced 215s, and I was a pretty cool physical fencer back then. And I remember coming out of my second 15 and not being able to feel the blade as I clipped on for my third 15. I couldn't feel the grip on my epee. So I think and I and I realized that one of the biggest mistakes I was making was I wasn't moving around. I thought it was all about the blade work, so I just kept doing blade work with them. But when a lot of the time they were just retreating, I didn't know anything about
Oh,
the tactics of wheelchair fencing, the technique behind wheelchair fencing. I was just fencing like an able-bodied fencer, just sitting upright, not really moving my body anywhere, and I just parried everything that I saw. So that kind of was my first impression of wheelchair fencing. But like going home and thinking about the entire experience and talking to my mom, who was an athlete, just not for fencing, talking about the differences between able-bodied and wheelchair, I think I got to realize that there was a lot that I wasn't doing, and that wheelchair fencing and able-bodied fencing are two very, very different games. But that's not to say that fencing a lot of wheelchair doesn't have a lot of benefits for able-bodied, which I will expand on when I talk about when I get to Durham,
okay.
because that really changed the game for me in terms of doing wheelchair fencing in the UK with Laszlo. and the people that I usually do wheelchair fencing with.
Okay, so you found it was a little different,
It was
much
very,
stronger
very
blade
different.
taking,
Much
and
stronger blade taking, a lot more intense, and
yeah,
and more importantly, the time between the time between the points was way shorter. As my style of epee fencing involves using the time a lot to grind out the opponent and fight a long haul kind of bout. Use all 3 3-minute periods, but the way that wheelchair fencing forces you to think means that um, you have to be very sure about what you're doing next. You have to be very analytical in a very quick amount of time. You have to make decisions quicker than you usually would than in able-bodied epee. Whereas in epee, I can think about what to do next while using my footwork and my blade work to limit my opponent's actions. Whereas in wheelchair, I don't have the luxury of footwork. The only thing that resembles footwork is me moving my body backwards and forwards and trying to create a tempo. And even then, the time where you're allowed to create that tempo to control your opponent is very small. That time frame is very small. So then coming to Durham and doing more wheelchair fencing than I thought I would be doing meant that I learned how to fight for the tempo faster, and I learned how to spend the least amount of time trying to control my opponent and badgering my opponent into doing something that would lead to an advantage for me.
yeah,
And
because if you're a bit on the down and able-bodied epee, right, you're able to move and shift and wait a bit until your focus comes back. But great mental training.
Yeah,
You have to
definitely.
be, yeah.
Yeah. At the same time, it also helped that at Durham, because of the level of the coaching and the level of the fencers, you had a core bunch of fencers who were who stayed in Durham for a long amount of time. So my good friend Josh Waddell, um, I remember fencing him for the vast majority of the past 3 years that I've been here, and he's always been a great training partner in the sense that there was someone who I ended up practicing my blade work with, and there was someone who was strong enough to resist my blade work instead of avoid it, in the sense where I was able to practice different actions that would prove useful in an able-bodied context. So to put this into greater perspective, when I fenced for a long enough time with able-bodied fencers, people realized that if they tried to contest me with blade work, they would lose 100%.
Okay.
There was no way, because at that level of fencing, at their level of fencing, there was no way that they could contest my blade work, simply because I'd been fencing way longer than they did, and I knew, and my knowledge and feeling for the combinations that I could take with regards to blade work was more than they could. So they tried to fence me with first principles. They tried to fence me with the most simplest terms at the most simplest terms. So they would try and use their footwork way more. They would try and keep a longer distance. They would try and threaten short target, which meant that when it came to blade work, I had very few options. And this was okay when it came to fencing them, because I was able to use my footwork to try and suppress the tempo that they were trying to create. But at the same time, when it comes to fencing outside of Durham, where people have pretty good blade work, not only in the British circuit, but also the international circuit, it became a problem for me because I couldn't find anyone who was willing to do blade work with me, simply because everyone in Durham was afraid of doing it. So in that sense, having the opportunity to fence wheelchair, having the opportunity for to have a training partner like Josh, and having the opportunity to be guided by Laszlo, a Paralympic coach, helped me in terms of my blade work, in the sense that not only did it make it more concise, but at the same time it also just gave me the opportunity to try out a lot of different things that I wouldn't be able to try out in the able-bodied, simply because of the added factor of footwork.
Okay. So that, I mean, yeah, so you're forced into a situation where you have to focus on one thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Or focus more on it, shall we say. Mm-hmm. I mean, coaches spend a lot of time trying to get all students to do that. It's pretty normal for us. But yeah, so do you have a little bit of a rivalry with Josh? I mean, he must have been a young man when you first turned up.
I mean, yeah. I think there is a bit of a rivalry, because every time I come out of a bout with Josh, I don't really think about really the result, but rather what is going to happen in the next bout. Because Josh is, I know for a fact that, unlike the university students that I'm fencing, Josh is going to be around in Durham for quite a while, which means that as long as I'm most likely, as long as I'm in Durham, I will have to fence Josh, and because of that, I will have to think of a way to like beat him. And at the same time, Josh has improved a lot over the time in the duration of the time that I've been here. So it means that I've had to develop new ways to try and beat him, just to stay in the game. And whenever he gets another aspect of wheelchair fencing, and whenever he figures something out, or if there's a new evolution in this fencing, I feel that kind of desire to deal with it, to mitigate it, to think of new ways to fence him. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm not going to be competing against him in the wheelchair fencing circuit, and we won't be direct rivals for, say, like a spot in the Paralympics or a spot in the finals of an IWAS World Cup. So at the end of the day, what we're doing for each other is we're trying to improve each other.
Yep.
And I appreciate that the fact that he's improving every week or every month, because it forces me to think of new things. It forces me to be a bit more creative in my approaches to him. It forces me to even like study wheelchair fencing. So through watching through training and fencing Josh, I feel like I've learned not about not only just about wheelchair fencing, but also about how I can apply the things that I learned in wheelchair fencing to able-bodied fencing. And I think that's helped my fencing a lot more in terms of not only in terms of blade work, what I just mentioned before, but also that quick flicker that I need to make an instant decision.
Yeah. So just, yeah, I mean, it sounds a little bit more intense. So good mental training for your, squashing your entire fight down into a smaller area, helping you focus harder for longer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There also have been bouts where in the past where when I hadn't done as much wheelchair fencing as before, where I would be quite vulnerable to people who press me a lot. If people tried to make the bout as short as possible and force me to fence on their terms, I felt very, very uncomfortable, because a lot of the time I would like to, the longer a bout goes on for in able-bodied, I feel the more time that I have to feel more comfortable fencing that opponent, the more time that I have to adapt to fencing to that opponent. And because of that, the more it benefits me. But a few smarter fencers in Hong Kong in tournaments, when they found out that I was like that, they kind of tried to finish the bout as quickly as possible, tried to get an early lead, and then off the momentum of that early lead, they would try and beat me as quickly as possible, like not even let the bout go into the second period. They would try and do a lot of that, and that was a hard time for me because I didn't feel very comfortable fencing. I didn't feel comfortable fencing at that high tempo. Whereas after doing a lot more wheelchair fencing, I feel like I'm ready off the line a lot more, because in wheelchair fencing you're forced to be ready off the line, otherwise you're gonna get hit. Especially with Josh, who has humongously long limbs. If I'm not ready against Josh, chances are I'm going to be hit very, very quickly, and I have no idea where I'm going to be hit. So I have to think about what I need to do before the start of the point. There's not a lot of time during the point to change. There is, granted, sometimes our points go on for quite a long time, and I can spot a few things which I can take advantage of, but at the same time I have to be very sensitive, and I have to be very observant to those changes, because those changes happen faster than they do in able-bodied fencing. So maybe an example of this is a good hit, like the typical hit that I take advantage of Josh, and he knows this as well, so I'm not afraid to say it on camera, is when he doesn't commit as much and he tries to pull back, and I go flick wrist, flick chest.
Okay.
But the action isn't important. What's more important is I'm taking advantage of his lack of ability to commit to the attack. Because if he stretched a bit more, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to start my attack, because I would be leaning all the way over the wheelchair to avoid his attack, because he's so long. But because his attack is short, for whatever reason, maybe he's trying to bait my attack out. Maybe he thinks that when he reaches enough, he can get me. Or maybe there's a problem with his lunge, which there turned out to be, and he's fixed that now. So whatever the reason is, I have to be aware of the fact that he's not going as far as he actually can go, and take advantage of it. In épée, in able-bodied épée, I might have 15 seconds or 20 seconds to think about that. Whereas in wheelchair fencing, that all of this happens in 3 seconds, max. So it means that I have to be way more observant of these things. I have to be way more sensitive to these things, and I have to develop ways in which I can be sensitive to these things.
So it's also training your tactical abilities, your tactical astuteness and awareness.
Yeah, it also, and most importantly, it kind of helps me read my opponent clearer, because to know what Josh wants to do to me next, I kind of have to think in his shoes, and that's what wheelchair fencing has done for me a lot. It's the high intensity bouts mean that I've been able to gain a greater awareness, at least for Josh's way of thinking, for Josh's mentality when it comes to fencing. Some of the traits that he has when he's down, some of the characteristics of him when his fencing when he goes up. And so it pushes me to look for tendencies in his fencing to do certain things. I already did that before I came to Durham, because that's essentially my style of fencing. But having the opportunity to fence with Josh, and having the opportunity to fence a lot with Josh, which is the most important part, meant that I developed this skill in the sense that it became faster for me to read opponents. And I think that aspect has greatly helped my able-bodied fencing.
Yeah, from your description, if people were able to hustle you off the piste when you were younger, because you didn't like to fence so fast, because you couldn't read them that fast, this has definitely given you the skills to cope with that.
Yeah.
The mental skills, as well as, of course, I mean, your hand will just be strong. Your point in your hand will be stronger just from.
Yeah. There are opponents who, if they rush me in the right way, and if they've read me completely like a book, then maybe I would still struggle. But that has become, over the past few years of combining able-bodied fencing and wheelchair fencing, that has decreased quite a bit. When fencers try to rush me, because at the start of any given bout, if fencers try to rush me, I feel like I have an idea of what I would do if a fencer tries to rush me. And doing a lot of wheelchair meant that after being rushed in a lot of different ways, it meant that I was ready for all the different ways people could possibly rush me with. Especially since rushing in able-bodied is very different from rushing in wheelchair. In wheelchair, you kind of just close your eyes, pray to God, and do like a super long lunge off your wheelchair. And because you're within that distance where you can hit the other person, that you usually end up with a light if your opponent isn't ready. Whereas in able-bodied fencing, if you try and rush someone from 4 meters out, because you start 4 meters away from each other, it's a lot easier to read what your opponent is going to do when they rush. With regards to their blade position, with regards to the speed they're moving at, with regards to the footwork that they're using, these are all things that from fencing a lot of wheelchair fencing, I've been able to integrate into my own able-bodied fencing and prepare myself better in the event that some madman wants to rush me at the start of a bout when I don't even know the dude.
Okay, so what about some advice? I mean, obviously we're going to advise everyone, if you have the chance to do wheelchair fencing, you should take it up, right? You should fence with the guys in the wheelchairs, because you can teach them if they can teach you. It's great. But what about advice for starting out? I mean, I remember the first times I fenced it. It was a little strange, but you have to persevere, right? So
yeah,
and try
definitely.
to figure out.
And I feel like this isn't just bridging the gap between able-bodied fencing and wheelchair fencing, but also this is more to do with bridging the gap between something that I find familiar and something that I find less familiar, and that is to find familiarity within the wheelchair fencing, because at the end of the day, able-bodied fencing and wheelchair fencing are different embodiments of different ideas and different ways in which people fence. There are limitations there are probably more physical limitations to wheelchair fencing, but that is not to say that these physical limitations define wheelchair fencing. So with an able-bodied fencer who wants to start out doing a little bit of wheelchair fencing to supplement the game, I would suggest to that fencer to think about what you want to get out of wheelchair fencing. Do you want to train yourself to be more ready? Do you want to train your blade work? Do you want to train that? Do you want to train the ability to make a series of quick decisions in a very short amount of time? These are things that, while you won't necessarily apply into able-bodied fencing all the time, it's still a good skill to have because it'll save your life. Whereas if you go into disabled fencing with an able-bodied mindset, especially in the case of épée, where the able-bodied game is way slower than the disabled game, and you go in there thinking about fencing like an able-bodied fencer and telling yourself you don't really know how to fence like a disabled fencer, well, maybe that's not the right way to approach it, because who said you have to fence like a disabled fencer to understand disabled fencing? Because yeah.
it's just a different set of parameters.
Yeah.
Right. The retreating distance is less. The distance between you is less.
Yeah.
Everything happens faster. You got to read it quicker. But other than that, it's the same game. It's just a different emphasis on the same thing, right? In the able-bodied, more about movement and waiting, and in the disabled, more about being ready, sharp decisions, and being really good with your hand.
Yeah, and like I know all the complaints that an able-bodied fencer can make about disabled fencing at the start because I've made all of them. Because I remember my coach asking me how I felt about disabled fencing, and I was complaining about, I can't move, the distance is too small, I can't use my footwork. They're all stronger than me. I have no idea what to do. And my coach is like, "You're being ridiculous, man.
Suck it up.
You can suck it up. You can retreat. You just retreat in a different way. Like, have you thought about like leaning back over your wheelchair ridiculously?" And I was just like, no, 14, can't do that. And yeah, and what I'm trying to say is even if there are physical limits, as I just mentioned before, as to what you can do in wheelchair fencing, that's not to say that you can't apply the stuff that you learn in able-bodied fencing to wheelchair fencing. So like, for example, trying to increase the length of time between points. The more you find a way to increase the time between in points as opposed to fencing the disabled game, the more you'll learn about wheelchair fencing, and the more you'll be able to understand the game. Because I remember what I used to do against Josh was try and make disabled fencing as much of an able-bodied fight as possible, increasing the length between points, increasing the length of the exchanges, and sooner or later, you come to realize how to you come to realize how to use tempo in a different way in wheelchair fencing to manipulate your opponent. That is quite similar to how you would do it in able-bodied. So instead of going, a disengage lunge off the line, or trying to do a fake and then go for the immediate touch 3 seconds after a ready fence, there is a way to make the points longer. Just because it's not as just because the time it takes to get a point in wheelchair fencing will never be as long as in able-bodied fencing, doesn't mean that you can't lengthen the time. Because once you lengthen the time that you need to get the points, not only are you making it more familiar to able-bodied fencing, you're also giving yourself a lot more opportunity to learn the disabled game without being messed up all the time. Because if you just launch yourself into the off the line 3-second attacks, or if you try and focus on solely making decisions off the cuff, you're going to take a longer time to learn about the wheelchair game, and you're going to take a lot more beatings. So for anyone who would like to pursue wheelchair fencing on the side to improve their able-bodied fencing, try and make the bout as familiar to yourself as possible, because not only are you spending more time to actually understand the game, you're also doing yourself a favor and not demoralizing yourself that much.
I mean, in another way, you're also stepping into their world.
Yeah.
Right? And you are a visitor.
Yeah.
So you're playing catch up, right? You put yourself at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
In their world. Off you go, start to learn.
Yeah. But at the same time, why tell yourself that you're at a disadvantage to them? Because at the end of the day, able-bodied fencing, wheelchair fencing, it's all fencing. And unless you've been stupid, or unless you've been dumb and you haven't listened to anything your coach has taught you, you know at least something about fencing. You know at least something about distance, timing, tactics, technique. You know, and like tempo, rhythm. You know these things as a fencer
Mhm.
once if you've learned the game. And taking these things and applying it to a way familiar to yourself in an unfamiliar situation, it's a skill that you need as a able-bodied fencer as well, because even in able-bodied fencing, able-bodied fencers come in different shapes and sizes. They come with this guy might have a weird prep, this guy might have super fast footwork, this guy might not move at all. You got to adapt to different people's. And how is that different from adapting from able-bodied fencing to wheelchair fencing? Because at the end of the day, it's all fencing, and you know the stuff that you know. And as long as you can apply it properly, you're probably going to be fine. Hopefully.
Yep. I mean, it's true. It's just fencing. It's slightly different, but it's just fencing. Can help you train. Can help you get better. Help them get better. Bring a lot more people into the sport. Actually, it's just great.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, that's what we always want, right? We want the whole club to integrate and everyone to be together.
Yeah.
So, and you're going to learn, and those skills are not just useful in fencing. You're putting yourself into a situation you're not used to.
Yeah.
So you're learning life skills.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
Because in life there will always be things that you're not familiar with.
Yep.
And how you deal with it is a skill that you have to completely learn along the way.
Yeah,
and the transition from able-bodied fencing to wheelchair fencing is it gives you very clear indicators of how to approach a very, very unfamiliar situation. So for everyone who wants to improve their game with the help of wheelchair, for any able-bodied fencers who want to improve their game with the help of wheelchair fencing, or even for any wheelchair fencers who want to fence a variety of different people by having able-bodied fencers fence them, please do. 100%. I couldn't recommend it more. I couldn't recommend it enough.
Yeah, just ask your clubmates. Ask everyone.
Yeah.
Right.
And like if your clubmate is someone who has to fence wheelchair, fence them as much as they can, because the wheelchair fencing community isn't as big as the able-bodied fencing community. And because you want to help your clubmates be the best fencers they can, you want to support your clubmates in the best way as possible, fence them as much as they can. Try and beat them. Try to beat the crap out of them, because
because they're going to do it to you.
Yeah, they're going to do it to you if you don't do it to them. And at the end of the day, it's not about who beats the crap out of the other person the most. It's about everyone improving as part of the club. And that's how you make the club strong.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we'll leave it there for today. Yeah. But I'm hoping for next week, I'll drop a call to Josh and see if he'll drop in and talk with us, and give us his opinion on fencing with you, mate.
That'd be nice. Well, I think we've spent so much time competing against each other, and sure, we talk to each other about the fencing, but at the same time, it's different sitting down and talking about how we fence each other as opposed to like doing it after a match.
Yep.
It's very different.
All right, Ching Ho. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks for having me.
All right. We'll see you again.
See ya.